Today, on June 18, 2025, we find ourselves at a critical juncture in global history, a moment that honestly many political leaders and media outlets in the United States are just, well, reluctant to discuss openly. The central, unavoidable truth is that the American empire is in a state of decline. And this isn't just some prediction or speculative forecast, it's an ongoing process, a slow and often painful transition that's, reshaping the world as we know it. For a century and a half, the United States experienced a remarkable ride up, a period of ascending economic, political, and cultural dominance. However, what goes up must eventually come down, and we are now living through the descent. The signs are everywhere, from the shifting global power dynamics to the deep-seated economic anxieties felt by millions of ordinary Americans right here at home. Understanding this decline is, honestly, the first step toward navigating the turbulent waters that lie ahead. It's a difficult conversation because it challenges the very foundation of American exceptionalism, that long-held belief that the United States is somehow immune to the historical cycles that have governed every great power before it. The denial of this reality is powerful and pervasive, creating a dangerous gap between the world as it is and the world as it is portrayed by those in power. This essay aims to bridge that gap, to lay out the evidence of this decline in clear and simple terms, drawing on the economic and geopolitical shifts that define our current era. We will explore the symptoms of this imperial retreat, from military quagmires to the rise of powerful new global players. The story of America's decline is not just a story about international relations or abstract economic theories. It is a profoundly personal story for the American working class. The consequences of this shift are not felt in the boardrooms of Wall Street or the halls of Congress in the same way they are felt at the kitchen tables of working families across the country. The rising cost of living, the crushing weight of debt, and the gnawing sense that the system is rigged are all direct results of this larger historical transformation. This decline is the context for the political polarization, the social unrest, and the widespread feeling of alienation that has come to characterize modern American life. It is the unspoken truth that fuels the anger and frustration of so many. As we examine the various facets of this decline, we must also look beyond our own borders to the forces that are rising to fill the vacuum. The emergence of the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with their new partners, represents the most significant geopolitical development of the 21st century. This bloc, led by the economic powerhouse of China, is not just competing with the United States. It is actively building an alternative global system, one that is less dependent on the American dollar and less beholden to American interests. The future is being written not just in Washington, D.C., but in Beijing, New Delhi, and Moscow, and we must pay close attention to what is being built. The life cycle of an empire can be compared to the trajectory of a rocket, a spectacular launch, a powerful ascent into the stratosphere, a period of coasting at its apex, and then the inevitable, often turbulent, return to Earth. For the United States, the period after World War II marked its apex. The nation emerged from the conflict with its industrial base intact and its economy booming, while its European and Asian rivals lay in ruins. This unique position allowed America to dictate the terms of the new global order, establishing the US dollar as the world's reserve currency and creating international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to project its influence. For decades, being an American meant being part of a rising tide that lifted many, though not all, boats. This period of ascendancy was characterized by widespread prosperity, at least for a significant portion of the population. The American dream, the idea that hard work could lead to a better life for oneself and one's children, felt tangible and real. The nation built highways, sent a man to the moon, and produced a culture that was exported and emulated across the globe. This was the ride up that shaped the consciousness of generations. The fundamental assumption was that this upward trajectory was permanent, a natural state of being for the United States. This belief became so ingrained in the national psyche that it made the prospect of decline seem not just unlikely, but utterly unthinkable. The system, it was believed, was working. However, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating in recent decades, the engines of that rocket began to sputter. The decline of an empire is rarely a single cataclysmic event. Instead, it is a slow unraveling, a series of seemingly disconnected crises that, when viewed together, reveal a clear pattern. The economic ground began to shift as manufacturing jobs were outsourced to cheaper labor markets, and the wages of American workers began to stagnate. The social contract that had guaranteed a measure of security for the working class started to fray. The prosperity that was once broadly shared became increasingly concentrated at the very top, creating a new gilded age of extreme inequality that hollowed out the middle class. The descent is a disorienting and often frightening experience for the citizens of an empire. What was once taken for granted, a stable job, an affordable home, a secure retirement, becomes a source of constant anxiety. The promises made by political leaders from both major parties begin to ring hollow as they fail to reverse the tide. This is the stage we are in now. The systems and institutions that were built for an era of American dominance are struggling to cope with a new reality where that dominance is no longer assured. The ride down is marked by denial, blame, and a desperate search for easy answers, all while the fundamental economic and geopolitical realities continue to shift beneath our feet. A key indicator of an empire's strength has always been its ability to project military power and achieve its strategic objectives abroad. For much of the 20th century, the United States military was seen as an invincible force. However, the story of the last 50 years has been one of a slow and painful education in the limits of military might. The first major lesson came in Vietnam. Despite deploying hundreds of thousands of troops and unleashing unprecedented firepower, the United States was ultimately forced into a humiliating withdrawal in 1975. The war not only cost tens of thousands of American lives, but also shattered the myth of American invincibility and deeply divided the nation, leaving scars that have yet to fully heal. It was a clear signal that military superiority does not always translate into political victory. This pattern of military overreach and strategic failure was repeated in the 21st century. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States launched a war on terror, invading Afghanistan and then Iraq. In Afghanistan, after 2 decades of occupation, trillions of dollars spent, and countless lives lost, the U.S. withdrew in 2021, only to watch the Taliban, the very group it had set out to destroy, sweep back into power within days. The chaotic scenes from the Kabul airport were a stark and globally televised symbol of imperial failure. Similarly, the invasion of Iraq, based on the false pretext of weapons of mass destruction, destabilized an entire region, created a power vacuum that gave rise to ISIS, and ultimately strengthened the strategic position of a key adversary, Iran. These high-profile defeats are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a deeper problem. They demonstrate a growing inability for the United States to impose its will on other nations through force. The world has become more complex and multipolar. Other countries observing these failures are less intimidated by American threats and more willing to chart their own course. The current conflict in Ukraine provides yet another example. The stated U.S. objective was to use crippling economic sanctions and military aid to bleed Russia dry and force its defeat. As we will explore later, this strategy has not only failed to achieve its goals but has, in many ways, backfired, pushing Russia closer to its allies in the BRICS bloc and exposing the limits of American economic warfare. The geopolitical consequences of these military setbacks are profound. Nations that were once firmly within the American orbit are now hedging their bets. Countries in the global south, for instance, increasingly look to China and other rising powers for investment and partnership, often playing the US and China against each other to secure better deals. The unipolar moment, that brief period after the collapse of the Soviet Union when the United States was the world's sole superpower, is definitively over. The decline in military effectiveness is directly linked to a decline in diplomatic influence. The world is no longer listening to Washington with the same rapt attention it once did, because the stick that America wields is no longer seen as being quite so big or effective. While the United States grapples with the challenges of its own decline, a new and powerful force is decisively rising on the world stage. This is the BRICS alliance, a grouping of nations that represents a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. Originally composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the bloc has recently expanded, welcoming new members and further solidifying its position as a counterweight to the Western-led G7 nations. This is not merely a symbolic alliance, it is an economic and demographic juggernaut that is actively reshaping the architecture of the global economy. The sheer scale of the BRICS bloc is staggering and demands our attention. Demographically, the numbers speak for themselves. The traditional G7 powers, the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Canada, represent a small and shrinking fraction of humanity. The United States itself accounts for only about 4.5% of the world's population. In stark contrast, the expanded BRICS nations now represent a massive portion of the global population, somewhere between 55 and 60%. This demographic reality has immense implications. For centuries, a small minority of the world's people concentrated in North America and Western Europe have dominated the global economic and political system. That era is rapidly coming to a close as the world's population centers begin to assert their influence. This demographic weight is matched by growing economic might. For the first time in the modern era, the collective gross domestic product of the BRICS bloc has surpassed that of the G7. The BRICS nations now account for approximately 36% of the world's total economic output, while the G7 has fallen to around 28%. This is a historic crossover point, a clear and quantifiable measure of the changing economic tides. While the US media often focuses on America's own economic performance, it frequently downplays this larger, more significant global trend. The engine of global growth is no longer located exclusively in the West. It has moved decidedly eastward and southward. The rise of BRICS is not just about numbers, it is about building new institutions and creating new systems. The alliance is developing its own financial infrastructure, such as the new development bank, to provide an alternative to the Western-dominated World Bank and IMF. There are active discussions about creating new payment systems and even a new reserve currency to challenge the supremacy of the US dollar. For developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, this provides a monumental new choice. They are no longer solely dependent on Washington for loans, investment, and trade. They can now turn to Beijing or New Delhi, fostering a new era of competition that empowers the global South and further erodes American hegemony. At the very heart of the BRICS alliance and the shifting global economy is the phenomenal rise of China. For decades, the narrative in the United States was that China was simply a low-cost factory for the world, a place to assemble products designed elsewhere. That narrative is now dangerously out of date. China has transformed itself into the fast-growing, dominant economy in the world, a leader in technological innovation, and a major competitor in the industries of the future. This reality is often downplayed or distorted in American political discourse, but it is a fact acknowledged by business leaders and economists across the globe. China is no longer just catching up. In many critical sectors, it is now leading the way. A perfect case study of China's new economic dominance can be found in the electric vehicle industry. The global competition to produce the highest quality, most affordable electric cars has been decisively won by a Chinese company named BYD, Build Your Dreams. While American consumers may be unfamiliar with the brand, BYD cars are becoming a common sight on the streets of Europe, Latin America, and Asia, lauded for their technology, design, and price point. In the United States, however, these vehicles are effectively banned. The US government, first under President Trump and now expanded under President Biden, has imposed a staggering 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, a protectionist wall designed to shield less competitive American automakers. This policy of protectionism reveals a deep-seated anxiety about America's declining industrial competitiveness. Instead of rising to the challenge and striving to produce a better, more affordable product, the US has chosen to block the competition. While this may provide a temporary shield for companies like Ford and General Motors, it comes at a significant cost to the broader American economy and to consumers. American businesses that rely on transportation, from delivery services to farms to construction companies, are denied access to cheaper, more efficient vehicles, making them less competitive on the global stage. American families are denied the choice of a more affordable electric vehicle, keeping them dependent on more expensive options or traditional gasoline-powered cars. It's a strategy born of weakness, not strength. Beyond electric vehicles, China's economic influence is felt everywhere. It is the world's largest trading nation and the premier source of investment for much of the developing world. Its Belt and Road Initiative is the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history, building ports, railways, and power grids across multiple continents. While the US offers military alliances and lectures on democracy, China offers loans and construction projects with fewer strings attached. This pragmatic, business-first approach has won it enormous influence, particularly in the global south. The economic center of gravity has shifted, and China is now the sun around which a large part of the global economy revolves. The decline of an empire is not just an external phenomenon, it's, felt most acutely within its own borders, especially by the working class. For the last 30 to 40 years, the average American has been caught in a tightening economic vice. While the headlines might celebrate stock market highs or GDP growth, the lived reality for millions has been one of stagnating wages, rising costs, and an ever-increasing mountain of debt. This internal squeeze is the domestic consequence of the global shifts we've been discussing. As the United States lost its unrivaled competitive edge, the pressure was transferred onto the shoulders of its workers, while the wealthy at the top insulated themselves and accumulated even more fabulous riches. The most obvious symptom of this problem is debt. Debt in the United States has reached unprecedented levels across every sector of society. Households are drowning in credit card debt, student loans, and mortgages they can barely afford. Corporations have also binged on cheap debt, with many so-called zombie corporations now existing only because they can borrow new money to pay the interest on their old loans, without ever turning a real profit. And most significantly, the US government itself is the biggest debtor in the history of the world. The national debt has exploded, driven by decades of tax cuts for the wealthy, endless wars, and corporate bailouts. This makes the entire economic system incredibly fragile and dependent on continuous borrowing. A crucial and often overlooked aspect of this debt is who the United States owes money to. The nation's two largest foreign creditors are Japan and China. The US government owes China roughly $850 billion. This creates a bizarre and unsustainable situation where American taxpayers are effectively sending a portion of their hard-earned money to China in the form of interest payments. This borrowing from a strategic rival allows the US government to fund its massive military budget and foreign interventions, like the war in Ukraine, without having to raise taxes on its own citizens and corporations. It is a way of financing imperial ambitions on a credit card, masking the true cost from the public while sinking the nation deeper into debt. On top of this mountain of debt, American workers have recently been hit by a punishing wave of inflation. This is not some mysterious act of nature, it's really a mechanism for transferring wealth. Inflation occurs when prices rise faster than wages, and that is exactly what has happened. It is the result of a conscious decision by the 3% of Americans who are employers to raise the prices of the goods and services they sell. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve's solution of jacking up interest rates only punishes the working and middle classes, who rely on credit for cars, homes, and small business loans. It is a policy that crushes ordinary people while leaving the wealthy, who do not need to borrow, largely untouched, further widening the chasm of inequality. The profound economic squeeze felt by the American working class has inevitably led to a deep and bitter political alienation. When people feel that the system is no longer working for them, that they are working harder for less, and that the future for their children looks bleaker than their own past, their faith in established political institutions begins to crumble. For decades, both the Republican and Democratic parties have presided over the policies, deregulation, free trade agreements, tax cuts for the rich, that have hollowed out the American middle class and accelerated the decline. As a result, a growing number of Americans feel that neither party truly represents their interests, leading to a volatile and unpredictable political landscape. This widespread discontent created the perfect conditions for the rise of an outsider political figure like Donald Trump. His appeal in 2016 was not based on detailed policy proposals, but on his recognition of the pain and anger felt by millions. He was the first major political figure in a generation to stand on a debate stage and acknowledge that the American working class was getting screwed by a corrupt system. He spoke of American carnage and promised to stand up to the political establishment that had sold out the country. His message resonated deeply with voters in the Rust Belt and other deindustrialized areas who felt abandoned and forgotten by the political elite in both Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street. On the other side of the political spectrum, Senator Bernie Sanders tapped into a similar wellspring of frustration, particularly among younger generations like Trump. He spoke of a rigged economy dominated by billionaires and corrupt corporations. He called for a political revolution to reclaim the government for ordinary people. His immense popularity during the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries demonstrated that the desire for fundamental change was not limited to one political party. However, the Democratic Party establishment worked tirelessly to shut down his insurgency, viewing his platform as too radical and a threat to their corporate donors. In doing so, they arguably missed their best chance to connect with the very working-class voters they were losing. The result of these dynamics is a nation more politically polarized than at any time since the Civil War. The political conversation is no longer about finding common ground or solving shared problems. It is a zero-sum battle between two warring tribes, each convinced that the other poses an existential threat to the nation. This deep division is not the cause of America's problems. It's really a symptom of the underlying economic decline. When the economic pie is shrinking for the majority of people, the fight over the remaining slices becomes more vicious. Trump, Sanders, and the broader political turmoil are all products of a system that is failing to provide a decent life for a growing portion of its people. The ongoing war in Ukraine has served as a powerful and tragic illustration of America's waning global influence and strategic miscalculations. The core U.S. strategy from the outset was to use Ukraine as a proxy to weaken a major geopolitical rival. The plan was twofold. First, to bog down the Russian military in a costly and unwinnable war. And second, to cripple the Russian economy through a war of sanctions of unprecedented scope and severity. The belief in Washington was that this economic pressure would turn the Russian people against their government, destabilize the country, and force a strategic retreat. This strategy, however, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the new global landscape and has failed on almost every front. The economic war against Russia backfired spectacularly. The sanctions did cause some initial disruption, but Russia, as a key member of the BRICS alliance, was not isolated. Instead of collapsing, its economy quickly reoriented itself. Russia simply redirected its vast oil and gas exports away from Europe and toward its partners in Asia, primarily China and India, who were more than happy to purchase Russian energy at a discount. The sanctions ended up hurting European allies who faced soaring energy costs and inflation, far more than they hurt Russia. In a stunning turn of events, the Russian economy has actually grown faster than the US economy over the past 2 years, partly fueled by its own wartime production, much like the US used World War II to exit the Great Depression. On the battlefield, the narrative presented in the Western media has consistently clashed with the reality on the ground. Despite billions of dollars in advanced weaponry and support from NATO, the Ukrainian military has been unable to dislodge Russian forces. As of today, the Russian army remains deep inside Ukrainian territory, controlling key industrial regions and slowly but steadily advancing. While the human cost on both sides has been horrific, it has become increasingly clear who is winning and who is losing the military conflict. The failure to acknowledge this reality in the West is another sign of the denial that accompanies imperial decline, a refusal to accept that a chosen strategy has failed and that a rival power could not be brought to its knees. This strategic failure has sent a powerful message to the rest of the world. It has demonstrated that the United States no longer has the power to unilaterally cripple the economy of a major nation that has powerful allies. It has accelerated the move away from the US dollar, as countries fear that their own assets could be seized if they fall out of favor with Washington. The Ukraine war has solidified the BRICS alliance, strengthened the partnership between Russia and China, and exposed the limits of American power in a multipolar world. It was a gamble based on an outdated map of the world, and it has ended up weakening America's own strategic position while strengthening that of its primary competitors. We stand today at a profound crossroads, a moment of immense uncertainty and historic change. The evidence strongly suggests that the era of unchallenged American dominance is over. The combination of military setbacks, staggering internal debt, deep political division, and the meteoric rise of a powerful new economic bloc in the form of BRICS, all point to an empire in a state of undeniable decline. The ride down is proving to be just as consequential as the ride up. And it's, forcing a painful reckoning for a nation long accustomed to being number one. The future, therefore, will be shaped less by the decisions made in Washington and more by two other powerful forces: the actions of the rest of the world and the response of the American people themselves. The first great variable is the continued evolution of the global system being built by the BRICS nations. The world is rapidly becoming multipolar. China, India, Brazil, and their partners are not waiting for permission to forge their own paths. They are building new trade routes, new financial institutions, and new alliances that operate independently of the old Western-led order. This creates a more complex and, in some ways, a more stable world, as power is more distributed. For the United States, this means learning to navigate a world where it is no longer the sole hegemon, but one of several major powers. It will require a shift from a mindset of dominance to one of diplomacy, negotiation, and genuine partnership. The second, and perhaps most critical variable, is the wild card of the American people. The central question for the coming years is this: will the American working class passively accept being made to pay the price for imperial decline? Will they continue to bear the burden of a system that produces soaring inequality, crushing debt, and endless wars while their own communities crumble? Or will they organize to demand a different future? The recent resurgence in the American labor movement, the unionization drives at companies like Starbucks and Amazon, the strikes by auto workers and writers, offers a glimmer of hope. It is a sign that a new consciousness may be emerging from the bottom up. Because the ruling class in the United States remains largely in denial about the reality of the decline, organized popular movements may be stronger and have more potential than we might suspect. The future is not pre-written. It is not a simple choice between Donald Trump or Joe Biden, two figures who represent different facets of the same failing system. The real choice is between continuing down a path of denial, inequality, and conflict, or forging a new path based on addressing the real needs of the American people and accepting a new, more modest role in a changing world. The decisions made by ordinary citizens in their workplaces and their communities will ultimately determine which path we take. If you found this discussion valuable, please share your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with others. Stay tuned for more updates and in-depth analysis.